Okay friends, let's get started on our job. Firstly, you want to make sure that the radiator is cool to the touch. You don't want to open it when it's hot. Also, make sure you're wearing hand and eye protection. We're going to press this down, turn it counterclockwise, and remove it away from our face. Take a peek at that radiator cap, make sure it's still in reusable condition. I'll go ahead and wipe this down and set it aside. Now let's make our way underneath the vehicle. We're going to be looking for the drain. If you were to look above this shield, you can find the white petcock right there. That's the drain for the cooling system. To gain access to that, we're going to go ahead and get the shield right out of the way. Along each side of this shield, you're going to find two 10mm headed bolts. Remove the pair. Now along with those bolts, you're going to find that you have push clips in between the mounting bolts. We're going to pause on removing those and move along to our three 8mm headed mounting bolts across the front. Now I'll use a trim tool, carefully get in between this area and separate it. At this point, we can carefully start pulling this down, and let's remove it from the vehicle. The next thing we're going to do is start draining the cooling system. If you were to turn this counterclockwise, it's going to allow coolant to come out of this area right here. Now when coolant comes down, you're going to want to make sure you have a collection bucket under it, and keep in mind that it might splash. Watch your eyes. To help prevent any splashing, I'll just put a hose on here. I'll use a 19mm to loosen this petcock. Let that fully drain. Now once it's done draining, let's continue by closing the petcock. Let's make our way right over to the negative battery terminal. We'll use an 8mm wrench, turn this counterclockwise, loosen it up just enough to remove it from the battery. Set that aside so it's making no contact with the battery. Now from right up on top of the engine, we're going to go ahead and remove this cover. You're going to find three 7mm headed bolts. Now we can start getting the air intake hose out of the way. To remove this, let's continue over at our 8mm headed clamp. You can also use a flathead for this. We're only going to loosen it far enough that we can grab onto this and carefully remove it from the throttle body. Once that's off of there, you also want to make sure you separate this hose. It should just pop right out of there fairly easily. Now we're going to move along to the mass airflow sensor wiring. To remove this, I'm going to squeeze on the tab right in the center, and then I'll pull this off. Every time you disconnect an electrical connector, you need to take a peek. If you see any funny colors, it's probably corrosion. Now there's one mounting harness for this that attaches right along the side here. We'll just go ahead and grab onto that and pull it up and out of the air inlet hose. Set that aside, someplace where you can easily find it. Now we're going to move along to the upper clamshell for the air filter housing. Along the inboard aspect, you're going to find 2 clips. I'll just reach under, grab onto it, slide it, and dislodge it. Now we can carefully grab onto this. We'll lift it up and out of the way. Underneath that, you're going to find your air filter. It's a good idea to go ahead and pull that out of the box and give it a close inspection. After that, I'm going to set it aside so no dirt or debris makes its way on top of the air filter. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is continue on by removing the throttle body from the area. To get the throttle body off of here, we're going to continue with the electrical harness located on the driver's side of it. Go ahead and grab onto the little tab where my thumb is, give it a squeeze, and slide it right on off of there. Give it a quick inspection for corrosion. Set it aside. Now we're going to continue on to our 4 8mm headed bolts. We'll remove all 4 and then we'll gently pull this up and to the side. If you're worried about damaging your cables, you can go ahead and pull those off of there, but you do not have to. Let's move along to the alternator wiring. It's going to be easiest to get this out of here if this wiring is out of our way. So we need some slack. We'll come right over here. I'm going to get in between the alternator and the tab here and just try to gently pry. Just enough so I can lift this up and off of here. We'll give it our close inspection and set that aside as well. Now we're going to move along to this one right here. This is going to have a little tab that generally you can grab onto with a small pick of some sort or even a small screwdriver. Now we're going to move down to the power wire coming off of the alternator. This is a wire that's connected directly to the battery, so it will have positive energy going through it if you have not disconnected the battery. Do not touch this or remove it if you have not disconnected the battery yet. You don't want to skip that step. We'll just pull off the rubber protective boot here, slide it up. And now we're going to remove the nut down here so we can remove this from the alternator. I'll use a 10mm to remove this mounting nut. Grab that wire, pull it off of there. We'll give that a close inspection as well. Make sure you don't have any corrosion. It's a good idea to sand it down if it does look like it has some on either side. Ours looks fine. Let's grab that wiring. I'm going to lift up on this and I'm going to try to gently pry underneath the wiring in this bracket just to separate it. Now we can swing this wiring all the way over to the driver's side and get it out of our way. To gain a little bit more access, we're going to go ahead and remove the idler pulley here. To remove the idler pulley, first, you have to remove the serpentine belt. Before you go ahead and take the serpentine belt off of here, take a quick note of its routing. There's pulleys it goes over, and there's pulleys it goes under. Keep all that in mind as we continue. Now I'm going to use a 3/8 drive ratchet. You can also use a serpentine belt tool with a 3/8 drive adapter on the top. We're going to come right down to the serpentine belt tensioner just underneath the alternator. Fit that into the tensioner, and then we're going to turn it counterclockwise to release tension from the belt. Just going to set this belt aside. Now we can start removing the idler pulley using a 15 millimeter. Now let's remove the upper radiator hose from the thermostat housing. To do that, I'll squeeze the clamp, slide it up, and then remove the hose. Set that aside. To continue getting this out of here, it's going to be easiest if you take the upper shell off of this. So to do that, you're going to be looking for 3 8mm headed bolts. We'll remove all 3. This one's a little harder to get to. Now we can grab onto the housing. We're going to give it a little wiggle and start to separate it. Now we're going to make our way over to the other side of the throttle body. Now grab onto the hose, give it a little tug. Once you have the clamp off there, we'll carefully use our pick and try to separate this from its mounting tube. Now I'm going to grab the hose and try to pull it off. Now we can slide the hose right off of there. Now we're going to move down here to this other hose. We want to go ahead and squeeze the clamp and remove it from the thermostat housing. While I'm squeezing the clamp, I'll continue with my pick, and I'm going to carefully try to lift it up and off. Now you don't have to fully remove this hose, but I'm going to do it because all I have to do is squeeze this clamp, pull it off of here, and that's going to make things a lot easier for me to get into this area. Like I said, you can do it without removing the other end. Once you have it broken free, just go ahead and grab onto it and pull it right off of there. Sometimes you have to give it a little twist at the same time. Just be very careful not to damage the hose in any way. With the hose out of the way, let's continue on to our electrical wiring harness right here. You want to push on the tab where my screwdriver is, and then gently pull this up and off of the thermostat coolant temp sensor. Once the hose is out of the way, we're going to continue on to removing the wiring right here. We're going to press on the tab right where my screwdriver is, and then we'll lift this up and off of the coolant temp sensor. Now we're going to move along to removing the coolant temp sensor from the thermostat housing. It's going to give you a lot more room to be able to get this out of here. To do that, I'll use a pick, and you should also use either a magnet or some pliers to grab onto the clip located behind here. We're just going to carefully pull that clip right out of there. We can set that aside. Now I'll grab the sensor, I'm going to give it a little wiggle, pop it up and out of here. Now on some of these thermostat housings, you might find that it has a spare sensor in it. It's not even connected to a wiring harness. We have to get the sensor out of there. You know what to do. Get in here, grab the clip, slide it out of position. Looks the same as the other one. Now we'll remove the sensor as well. Now at this point, we're going to move along to these three 8mm headed bolts. You're going to find two of them out in the open. The third one's going to be a little bit harder to get to behind this area. To easily access this, you want to use an 8mm with a swivel. Let's go ahead and stick it down in there. I'm going to start with the hardest one first. It is common for the rearward bolt to break. If it breaks, the job just got a whole lot harder. Just go ahead and try to work at this. If you want to use some penetrant, it's probably a good idea. I'll leave that right in there, continue on to the other two. Let's move along to this clamp. Now I'm going to hold pressure on this clamp so it's in the squeezed position. And now we're going to try to draw the thermostat housing up and out of position. You can see it starting to separate from the hose. Give this a little wiggle, and we're going to try to slide it out of here. Now that we have this broken free, we can remove this rearward bolt as well. Keep in mind, when you go to install the new thermostat housing, you want to make sure you put this back in before it's in the fully mounted position. It'll be very difficult to slide it in at that point. There it is, friends. With the thermostat housing out of position, the next thing you want to do is pay attention to the mounting area where it needs to mount. Looking at this one, you can tell that there's a little bit of gray gasket maker in the area. You want to make sure that this is a clean, smooth surface so when you go to put in the new housing assembly, it'll have a perfect surface to mount to. I'll use a razor blade and I'm going to try to scrape everything out and away from this hole in the center. Do not scrape things into the hole. Now that I've scraped down the engine area where the housing goes, I'll just go ahead and wipe it down so it's a clean surface. Give it a thorough inspection. Make sure you don't see any pitted areas. If you see any pitted areas, you could potentially get a coolant leak in this area. Now let's move up to this metallic tube right here. We want to clean this down and make sure it's not rusted, rotted, or damaged in any way as well. It's common to see a little bit of rust, and that's fine, but if there's any pits or large holes, you need to go ahead and replace it. Now it's going to be time to start preparing our brand new thermostat housing. As you saw during the removal process, we have to remove the upper thermostat housing from the lower assembly. We'll use a 10mm and remove all 3 of these mounting bolts. Let's get this in the vehicle. Before we go ahead and slide this into the engine, let's have a look at the bottom side. This is the area that's going to go right up against the engine. It has a rubber seal. Make sure you lubricate that rubber seal with something such as possibly a little bit of coolant, a tiny bit of motor oil, or even just a little bit of silicone paste. As we bring this down into position in the engine, you want to make sure that you have this area lined up with the hose that's down there. As we start sliding it down, we want to make sure that this slides into that hose. As I slid it down, I was also trying to line up the mounting hole back here, the area that we cleaned down on the engine and the area that we had the seal that we lubricated. As I pressed it down, I could feel it sliding into position, and then I heard a little click telling me that I'm in the proper placement. Let's get that bolt in there, and now we're going to bring this over and start sliding it in position. All right, so now that we have that down there, I can feel that it's in the proper position. I'm going to pause on the mounting bolts and continue on to our rubber hose. Let's slide this hose onto the metallic tube first. Press it in as far as it can go. You can see the area that it needs to bottom out against. Don't leave it loose. You don't want this popping off while you're driving down the road. Sometimes a couple good twists while you're pushing will help it on there. Now we're going to swing the other end down onto the thermostat housing. Once you have it so the hose is in pretty close to proper position, we're going to pause on the clamps so we still have movement coming from this area. Now I'll continue on with my 8mm with a swivel. I'm going to start this rearward bolt in by hand. I want to make sure I'm not cross-threading it into the engine. Like I said, if you strip it out or damage it, you're going to have an issue back there. Once that one's started, we'll continue on to the other two. Once they're all started, bottom them out. Let's torque each of these bolts to 8 foot-pounds. Once you have it torqued, continue on to your lower hose. Let's make sure the clamp is in the proper and tightened position. Double check it. You do not want a coolant leak. Now I'm going to move to the upper hose. I'll make sure that I slide it in position all the way down against the thermostat housing. Put the clamp back in its original position. Give it a tug to make sure it's secure. Do the same to the other side. Now it's going to be time to put in your coolant temp sensor. Looking back here, you can tell that we have one port that's open for the coolant temp sensor. Looking along the side of it, we put a plastic plug in here with a clip. If you want to, you can go ahead and pull that clip, remove this plastic plug, and put your spare sensor in that position. It's not connected into anything, it doesn't do anything, so you don't necessarily have to. This one right here, you do have to put in one of those coolant temp sensors. Take this, we'll slide it right into position. You can tell it slides down as far as it can. The top area with the octagon is going to fit directly up against the thermostat housing. After that, go ahead and grab one of your original clips and slide it in the proper position, locking the coolant temp sensor into the thermostat housing. Once you have your mounting clip in there, grab that sensor, give it a wiggle, try to pull it out of the thermostat housing. It needs to stay in there. Now it's time for the electrical connector. Go ahead and slide that in, listen for a click, give it a tug, make sure it's secure. Had a little click there. I'm gonna give it a tug. Oh yeah, nice. Now we can get this smaller hose onto the metallic tube here. We're going to try to slide it on there as far as we can. Then we'll slide the clamp into its original position. When you're setting the clamps, make sure it's putting no pressure on any of the flex hoses around it. You don't want it to cut in with the vibration of the engine. Now we can put on our upper thermostat housing. We'll slide this right in position on top of these. Should slide right down. Now we'll start in all 3 of these mounting bolts and we'll torque each of them to 89 inch-pounds. Now, since this rearward bolt is the hardest one, that's the one I'm going to start with. That one's torqued. Let's get the upper radiator hose back onto the thermostat housing. We'll slide the clamp back into its original position and release it. Okay, I'll just adjust it. Grab that hose, try to pull it off of the thermostat housing. Make sure it's tight. Grab a rag, wipe down your intake where the throttle body needs to sit. This needs to be a smooth, clean surface so no dirt or debris makes its way inside of the engine. Once that's clean, continue on to the back side of your throttle body. There's a rubber seal that comes along here. You want to give it a close inspection. Make sure it's not dry rotted, cracked, or damaged in any way. After that, just go ahead and wipe it down. Try to get out any of the debris as you can along inside of this area. Commonly, there's going to be some carbon or black stuff inside of this area. You can go ahead and clean that down, or if it doesn't look too bad, just get ready to reinstall this onto the intake. As we bring this over to the intake, pay attention to your 2 cables. You want to make sure it doesn't look like they're twisted. Maybe when you were hanging it, you could see that they twisted like this. It's not going to function properly. Make sure they're straight and grab your 4 mounting bolts. Now we're going to start in all 4 of our mounting bolts. These are coarse threaded bolts. You want to make sure that they go into the plastic by hand. You want to make sure you catch the original threads. Now we'll torque each of these bolts to 80 inch-pounds. Now let's put in the idler pulley. I'm going to start this bolt in by hand, make sure it's starting to thread in, and then we'll continue on by snugging it up. Now we'll torque this to 35 foot-pounds. Now it's going to be time to reinstall the Serpentine belt. As I told you when we were removing it, you need to make sure it goes over and under all of the pulleys properly. Some of your pulleys will have grooves. Those are the pulleys the belt needs to go over. Other pulleys, like the idler pulley, are smooth. That's the area for the back side of the belt to go around. If you can't remember how it went, we've got a little diagram for you. Now let's just go ahead and take this and we're going to get ready to put it back in position. I'm going to put it over all the pulleys that have ribs. I'm going to look down along the bottom to make sure it's set in along the crank and every pulley down along a little lower. That looks good. So now at this point, I'm just going to continue on. What we have to do is grab our tool and we're going to turn that counterclockwise. As we do, we're trying to slide the belt onto either the alternator right here or the idler pulley, whichever one's easier for you. Before I remove my tool, I'm going to give this a quick check. I want to make sure it's sitting inside all of the grooves properly. If you're off by even one groove on one pulley, you can destroy your serpentine belt. This looks good. Get my tool out of here. And now we can continue on with the air intake. Looking along this area, you can find that you have 3 mounting ears. Looking at the lower box, you're going to find the 3 holes that it fits into. Just go ahead and slide it right in. Now I'm going to swing this down. I'm not going to worry about the clips yet. I'm going to move right up to where this connects into the throttle body. Let's take this and slide it in position. Make sure it's bottomed out as far onto the throttle body as possible. Let's tighten this clamp. Grab that hose, try to pull it off of the throttle body. Now let's slide this into proper position as well. Now we're going to move along to our wiring. We'll take this wiring and we're going to slide it into its mounting position. Reconnect in your mass airflow sensor. Listen for a click. Now let's reach down and re-lock in our locking tabs. Just going to pull this up and then swing it down to lock it. Do the same to the other. Grab that box, make sure it's secure as well. Let's make our way over here. We're going to connect in our throttle position sensor. Now let's move along to reconnecting in the alternator. We're going to start with that power wire. Make sure you do this before you reconnect your negative battery terminal. Slide it right on there. Now we'll connect on our 10mm headed nut. Just going to make sure this is nice and snug down here. There we are. Give that wire a wiggle. Now we're going to make sure we put on our rubber protective boot. This is very important. Do not leave this uncovered. Now let's reconnect in our center wire. Listen for a click, give it a little tug. Let's get the larger wire. This one has the tabs facing towards the front of the vehicle. Give that a tug. Now we're going to re-secure the wiring all the way over here. We'll slide that into its mounting position. You don't want to leave this loose. It could potentially fall down and get caught in your belt. Let's make our way over to the negative battery terminal. We'll slide this as far down onto the battery post as possible. Make sure it's nice and tight. Now let's make our way right up here to the petcock. We're going to make sure that it's nice and tight. There we are. Now we can put our lower shield back in place. Make sure you slide your lines into the proper position. Now as we move along each side, we're going to line up our push clips with the corresponding hole. Go ahead and press it up in there. Do the same on this side real quick. Once it's up there, you can continue on with your 10mm headed bolts for either side. We'll do the same to the other side here. Let's snug them up. We'll put in our 3 8mm headed bolts for the forward aspect here. Now we can put our cover on top of the engine. Remember, you have 3 mounting holes with 3 mounting bolts, and those need to line up with the intake in the proper position. Now for me, I'm just going to continue by using a funnel. I have an adapter here that screws right on and it's nice and tight. I don't have to worry about coolant flowing out of the radiator as I try to fill this. I'll slide the funnel right on here, and now I'm going to go ahead and top off the coolant. Once I get some coolant inside this, we're going to go ahead and run the vehicle for a little while. You're going to find the coolant makes its way down and air makes its way up. Keep filling this up, making sure that the coolant does not run dry in the funnel. It's important to make sure that you use the proper manufacturer specified coolant. You also want to make sure that it's either pre-mixed 50-50 or you mix the concentrate with distilled water. Okay friends, we got our thermostat housing installed in the vehicle. At this point, you're going to want to make sure that you top off that coolant inside of your funnel. Go ahead and start up the vehicle, let it run for approximately 10 seconds and turn it right back off. After that, make your way back out here and double check that serpentine belt. Like I said before, it has to be sitting on each one of the grooves perfectly. If it's off by one tooth, you're going to ruin the whole serpentine belt and you're going to have to replace it. Aside from that, you're going to want to go ahead and start up the vehicle again and let it run for a little while. You're going to want to put the heat in the hot position and put the blower motor on high. That's going to make it so the thermostat can open up and allow the coolant to flow through the system. It'll also help burp out any air. Once you start feeling as though you've got plenty of heat coming from the vents, continue checking that funnel. Make sure it's topped off and make sure you don't see any air bubbles making their way up and out. Assuming everything's done and you have no more air coming out of that system, go ahead and remove the funnel, close it off by putting on your radiator cap, and then make your way over to the overflow. You're going to want to make sure that you go ahead and top that off as well. After that, go ahead and close the hood and take it for a road test. Thanks for watching.